Good evening. I'm Lisa German, University Librarian and Dean of Libraries here at the University of Minnesota, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the first of our three-part Friends Forum series, Amplifying Black Narratives. The University Libraries is a proud partner with our Friends of the University Libraries in presenting the Friends Forum, and I'd like to say thank you to our wonderful friends. The Friends Forum, a series for curious minds, showcases intriguing experts speaking about topics relevant to our community. This evening, our panel will examine the role of community-based archives and university collections in preserving the past, present, and future of Black art and culture. We are excited to have our panelists share their expertise and their experiences with us. We ask that you remain muted throughout the program, and you'll notice two buttons at the bottom of your screen. Please use the chat button if you have technical questions, and the Q&A button if you have questions for our panelists. You may submit your questions at any time, and we'll get to as many as possible after the discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to share a perspective that is important to all of us. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It's important to not acknowledge the people on whose land we live, learn, and work, as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with tribal nations. We acknowledge that these words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. And now I'd like to welcome our moderator for this evening, Cecily Marcus. Cecily is the Director of Collections at the Minnesota Historical Society. From 2009 to 2021, Cecily served the university and community as the curator of the Givens Collection of African American Literature, the Performing Arts Archives, and the Upper Midwest Literary Archives. She is also the founding principal investigator of Umbra Search African American History, an award-winning initiatives that brings together hundreds of thousands of African American primary source materials from over 1,000 libraries, archives, and cultural heritage organizations. Now I'm going to turn it over to you, Cecily. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean German, and good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you all for coming to the first University of Minnesota Libraries event for the new academic year. I'm Cecily Marcus, Director of Collections at the Minnesota Historical Society, and it's great to be back here as moderator and a privilege to be in conversation with our esteemed panelists, Dr. Catherine Squires, Jojo Bell, and Dr. Tia-Simone Gardner, two of whom I've had the pleasure of working with. After brief introductions, we'll have an opportunity to hear a little bit about the work of each scholar, artist, activist, and their experiences in and reflections on the power or poverty of archives in amplifying Black narratives, past, present, and future. I've prepared several questions that I hope will spark a rich dialogue among them, and you'll have the opportunity to pose your questions to the panelists by typing them into the Q&A box. Please feel free to ask your questions throughout the conversation, and we'll get to them closer to the end. So it's my honor to introduce our panelists. Dr. Catherine R. Squires is Professor of Communication Studies at the University of Minnesota. She's the author of many books, including The Post-Racial Mystique, and editor of Dangerous Discourses, Feminism, Gun Violence, and Civic Life. As a 2017 to 2019 Bush Fellow, Dr. Squires focused on understanding intergenerational trauma, culturally relevant healing practices, embodied story sharing, and movement. She has engaged in long-term partnerships with Gordon Parks High School and the Hallie Q. Brown Center, Community Center in St. Paul. Dr. Squires received her BA from Occidental College and her PhD from Northwestern University. Jokeda Jojo Bell is the founder, executive director, and director of exhibitions and programming for the African American Interpretive Center of Minnesota, AAICM. As she wrote in Minnesota Women's Press in early 2021, she, quote, founded the African American Interpretive Center of Minnesota to help address the dearth of exhibitions and historical programming about Black Minnesota history. The mission is simple, she writes, share Black Minnesota history through exhibitions and events. Her leadership has led to collaborative programming with the Minnesota Historical Society and the Minnesota Museum of American Art, among others. In 2019, Ms. Bell curated the Builders exhibition for AAICM, named one of the top 10 exhibitions of the year by the Star Tribune. Currently, Ms. Bell is writing a book provisionally titled Red Stained, The Life of Hilda Sims, scheduled to be published by the Minnesota Historical Society Press in 2022. Ms. Bell received her BA from Hamline University and her MA in History from Louisiana State University. And Dr. Tia-Simone Gardner is an interdisciplinary artist, educator, and Black feminist scholar who works primarily with drawing, still and moving images, archives, and space. Dr. Gardner grew up in Fairfield, Alabama, where she also received her BA in art and art history from the University of Alabama. In 2009, she received her MFA in interdisciplinary practices and time-based media from the University of Pennsylvania. She's participated as a studio fellow and Whitney Independent Study with the Whitney Independent Study Program at the Whitney Museum of American Art, as a fellow for the Givens Collection of African American Literature, and as an invited guest artist at national and international artist residencies. She's the recipient of the McKnight Visual Artist Fellowship and a 2020 Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship, among others. Some of Dr. Gardner's most recent work includes the installation Unvessel at Lilydale Regional Park, hosted by the Minnesota Museum of American Art. Dr. Gardner has served as a mentor and teacher at Juxtaposition Arts, and she received her PhD from the University of Minnesota and is assistant professor of media studies at Macalester College. Thank you all for being here. Dr. Squires will first introduce her work, followed by Ms. Bell, and then Dr. Gardner. Welcome, Dr. Squires.
Hi, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight for this conversation. I'll just say a few words about some of the work I've done locally in archives. It's actually an interesting conversation to be having for me this very day, because I just started working with a new research assistant who's an architecture student. And he had never heard of Cap Wigington, who built many structures in the city of St. Paul. And he grew up in Minnesota, and he's a young African-American man who aspires to be an architect. And it's not until his senior year in college that he ever heard of Cap Wigington, because he applied for this job that I have to help local historian Frank White, who wrote They Played for the Love of the Game, about Black baseball in Minnesota, also a story that is not very often told since in the days before he wrote his book, and has been able to amplify that story, particularly through his connections to local baseball teams. But the point is that I moved here in 2007, and in 2007, the Twin Cities were getting ready to plan for the new light rail, the Green Line, which goes down University Avenue. And as a newcomer to the Twin Cities, I didn't know the story yet of the construction of I-94 and how it came through the heart of the Rondo community, although I knew of such stories in other cities around the country. And it was through my work at Gordon Parks High School, which sits right on University Avenue, working with students there on civic-oriented media projects, and then that developing with my colleagues there, Paul Krieger and Robin Hickman Winfield, into more and more digital storytelling and interaction with elders, so people could understand that the namesake of their school lived and thrived in St. Paul as a young artist, and came back to the Twin Cities many times, even though all of its doors were not open to him. those kinds of stories really matter. And that's why community-based archives matter, because as my new research student, Andrew, said today, after I told him that someone had written a biography of architect Cap Wigington long ago, but guess what? It's out of print. And he just looked at me and he said, he made buildings that are still standing. He had a biography written and published about him by a historian with a PhD, and yet and still nobody knows his story, even a student in architecture in the Twin Cities in his senior year in the School of Architecture. And so I think that story for me kind of says it all, why this kind of work is important, because the institutional anchors have not been strong enough or have been absent. And so having community-based archiving and sharing and public circulation, I think, is really, really important to finally breaking this cycle of the kinds of gatekeeping and resource restriction that have made it hard for stories that one would think would be much more accessible to be accessible to a wider public. So I'll stop there and I will turn it over to Jojo Bell.
Thank you, Dr. Squires, and thank you, Cecily, for the introduction. As she introduced me, I'm Jojo Bell, and I'm the founder of the African American Interpretive Center of Minnesota, really known as AAICM. And I'm a native Minnesotan, but I feel like I hadn't heard many Black history stories until really after high school and like a few years into college. And I feel like I had to really seek those out. I think in Minnesota, we don't get Black Minnesota history taught to us early on. I feel like maybe even Minnesota history, we don't really, dive into, especially at the junior high school level. And I felt like I had to really search those things out instead of just having that background and all of the stories I learned later. I just kind of wondered, are there other people who don't know some of these stories? And of course, there are people out there who don't. And so just to tell you how I came to found AICM, so I finished my master's in LSU and I came back home and I really wanted to write Black Minnesota history. And then also I just felt like some of these stories, and some of them I'm writing, for example, like the life of Hilda Sims, I don't feel that those were being made public. So there's a side where there are academics, like Dr. Squires said, writing about these stories that are just kind of unknown or little known, but in terms of a public history area or avenue, we haven't really explored that a lot in our state and in the Twin Cities. And in 2015, I presented a paper for the National Association of African American Studies, and that was about a beauty contest in 1891 that was run here through the Appeal, which is one of our first and oldest Black newspapers. It's not in existence anymore, but and that kind of explored some of these things that we kind of still grapple with, like issues of colorism and what does it mean to support Black businesses and all that kind of all of those issues. And so I wanted to bring stuff like that I was just kind of researching on my own to a wider audience. And I wanted to do that through public history. So kind of to backtrack, if people aren't familiar with AICM, we do exhibitions and events that share Black Minnesota history. And some past events include, our first exhibition actually was Minnesota's Black Past and Photographs. And I think we're going to get into this when we talk about archives, and Cecily might answer one of your questions later. But that the real aim and goal of that exhibition was to put Black Minnesotans who were here at a certain period of time in the proper context, meaning I think there's this kind of myth or just kind of view that we have of Minnesota as completely white, it's majority white, but completely white, especially in a certain period. So it was really important for us to show that there were Black Minnesotans here before statehood, so before 1858 in Minnesota as well. And so that's just kind of, that's like a taste of kind of what we try to do. And then in terms of community archives and creating archives, our latest exhibition, Outer Experiences, Black Life in Rural and Suburban Minnesota, that was actually based off of an oral archives that we created. So we interviewed 21 narrators about their experiences of growing up outside of the Twin Cities. So yeah, again, thank you for having me. And with that, I'll throw it over to Tia-Simone Gardner.
Thank you so much, Jojo. And thank you so much, Jojo. And thank you to Cecily and to the libraries for having me. I'm gonna share my screen. As Cecily mentioned, I grew up in Fairfield, Alabama. I moved to Minnesota about 8 years ago and have come and gone in between now and then. I am a practicing artist and have thought a lot about the archive and what it enables and what it limits from that position, and from that the work of being an artist and a cultural producer. I've been thinking a lot about land as archive and working with my own family's history from Birmingham and Fairfield, Alabama, and thinking about this place that I am now. A lot of the things that I've been sort of stewing on have to do with geology, and thinking about the earth as its geologic record. That relationship to Blackness and Black space and violence, and how it, like, each time we disturb the earth, intentionally or not, we contribute to this record. A few years ago, as some of you know, through the Equal Justice Initiative, Alabama created a museum that was the lynching museum, and in each county, they were given the chance to reclaim what are called their monuments. Each county, a bit of soil was taken from beneath places where people were hanged, and taken to this museum, began by Brian Stevenson. And so what you see on the image in the bottom right are those containers, and that there's been a ongoing, like, series of these public reclamations where people can reclaim their monuments, but there are a lot of counties that are not ready to acknowledge those histories. And in some of the research that's been happening, you find out where some of these things come from. And I learned that in the county that I'm from, Jefferson County, one of the sort of hidden histories is that, like, a part of the relationship between extraction and lynching is mining. That Birmingham, the Magic City, is the Magic City because all of the things that you needed to make steel could be taken from the earth in that place. And that the site that is now the Birmingham Botanical Gardens, it was a grave at a certain point, and that there are possibly two bodies still underneath this sort of beautiful site that's on the Red Mountain south side of the city. And I think about, like, the place that I'm from that has this very green edge of trees lining it, that to, the unknown, no unknowing eye appear benign, but it's actually a color line to keep one side of the city away from the other. And that my family grew up inside that, and I also grew up inside that place. And have been working with my mom to do a visual and oral history about these sort of making of an industrial capital model city that they were never supposed to actually live in because we were Black. I've been sort of trying to think about what it means to do that from here to there, and have certainly been thinking about the river. And I'm glad, Catherine, that you started by talking about Cat Whittington, because a lot of those structures he built were also around water. And so like a lot of the ways that I have been and am trying to think about archive now are not necessarily through the sort of tracing of archival documents, but with the body, and the ways that we try to think through something like land and land acknowledgement should be with our body and with our feet. So I think that that's maybe all I should say, but I can definitely say more as we talk through Q&A about what these things mean and where we're gonna go. So thank you all, and I'll turn it over to Cecily.
Well, thank you all for those wonderful introductions and entries into your work. It's so interesting how you've all talked about sort of questioning what is an archive, what is in it, how are those things shared or failed to be shared. Dr. Gardner, I love the idea of a geological record as an archival record. And Dr. Squires, you started with Cap Wigington, and even though his papers are collected in the Northwest Architectural Archives at the University of Minnesota or digitized for Umbra Search African American History, what is the value and meaning of those materials if they're not spoken about, if they're not taught, if they don't become part of the stories that we tell and that we know? And similarly with what you were describing, Ms. Bell, about having sort of aspects of Minnesota history and Black Minnesotans erased from the story of the statehood of Minnesota, and what it means to recover that. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about how archival collections are always incomplete. They're only made up of what we've saved and what institutions have collected, the materials that have survived the water and the floods and other natural disasters. But in the context of Black archives, I've been really struck by how the silences and the things that aren't there are structural, they're fundamental, that there were hundreds of years when Black people weren't allowed to be taught to read and write. There were millions of enslaved people who never became doctors and politicians and artists and lawyers, the people who would have collected papers and their correspondence and whose papers would be in our collections now. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about how you have navigated and how you try to represent archival silences that you encounter in your research and in your work.
I think, if you don't mind if I go first, I think from that first exhibition that we had that I mentioned at the beginning, I think we tend to, as historians, we really want concrete names, information, dates, places. And I think for our exhibition, we included, and Cecily, we're talking about the archives, we included pictures where the person was for their museum label, it was just unidentified African American or unidentified, African American woman or male, because even though we don't know their name or their backstory, it's really important, again, and especially for the exhibition that we did, to show that, yeah, this photo is from, the late 1800s. And yes, you can see that there's this Black family, even though they're not identified, but that they were here. So it's one way to kind of honor them and try to tell their story in the context of the state history, even though we don't have these concrete ideas about them. So that's just kind of one way we tried to navigate the silence in that first exhibition.
I would say there's another way of thinking about this question, which is trust. I can say that one of the most rewarding experiences of working with the Hallie Q. Brown Archive was just seeing members of families, either children or grandchildren, bringing things to my colleague Don Selly and saying, we trust you to keep this. And just thinking about how much lack of trust with other institutions that are supposedly tasked with keeping history for all Minnesotans. Those boxes in the attics and the basements were not brought forward. And so thinking about, families that have Bibles from the Civil War, so the idea that no one was collecting, I think, is something we should interrupt as well, because I think people collected, kept, and held, cherished many objects of their ancestors or their contemporaries, but because of the way that museums and libraries were not interested, except for as kind of trophy hunting, or the kind of anthropological, almost zoological way of thinking about Black life that dominated in many parts of our history. Why would you bring those objects to an institution that saw you as subhuman or dismissed you or wouldn't even let you in their doors, right? Wouldn't sell you a ticket. So I think there's a couple of things within that question about, are there collections that have never been shared because there was either nowhere to share them, or they're being shared in different ways that aren't part of that storage mentality and the kind of checklist mentality that the logic of some archives of just the record keeping versus the living circulation of objects of care. So I think about my great grandfather's Bible that has everybody's birth date written in it, including my own and now my children's, right? So like that to me is part of an archive, but I'm not going to donate it to, I'm probably not going to donate it to a museum, but maybe one day I would, but I don't know why I would do that. So just thinking about how people engage in sharing history and then what parts of it have been institutionalized or available for institutionalization, or even regarded as worthy of institutionalization, I think is another part of that picture, because there are plenty of literate Black folks throughout the history of this country who have been able to write things down. But whether or not any institution of record considers that worthy, like when Jojo was talking about the appeal, Black newspapers, people didn't collect Black newspapers for a really long time, but the people who did keep them, HBCUs and local libraries, or people who had a stack of the Spokesman Recorder in their basement, those kinds of things are really valuable. And there's an opportunity there that having a community-based trusted space for those things to come finally, when people are ready to part with them, is I think an important thing to think about as well.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll just say quickly, thank you both for those really sharp thoughts. I am working with my family, there's a lot of trauma in going backwards. Like there's a lot of trauma in going backwards into particular parts of a Black past. And it's not that it's all traumatic, but there's a way in which you form questions. If you ask a question directly, sometimes it's really hard for them to like pull that story up out of their heads or hearts or spirits. But I found going at the question sideways, talking about things like architecture and, you know, the church parking lots and, you know, like the spaces that actually brought them joy, that, you know, were absolutely inside of these, you know, color bars, absolutely inside of those spaces of terror and horror. We started to get at a lot of the history that had been around me all along, but like it didn't mean, you know, what was it like growing up inside of a color line? Like that's not necessarily they would never have even thought of their everyday existence in those terms necessarily. It's they're aware of it. It's not that they're in denial, but as a sort of like everyday way of being, you know, they remembered skating, you know, and playing in the playing, you know, making boats in the sidewalks in the when it rained and like things like that. And those aren't stories that I could have gotten if I had stayed along a very sort of narrow kind of archival question, perhaps. And so I think like that's been also my experience, is like finding a way into their very like situated memories, required me to think with them instead of, you know, my like a sort of particular understanding of what I thought their experiences were, of the past and present.
Thank
If I
you.
could just
Thank you. Yeah,
circle
please go
back to,
ahead.
yeah, Dr. Squires, what you said about, you know, trust. And I think even on top of trust, it's also who cares about these stories. So we're all on these panels because these stories are important to us and they're interesting to us. And we know that they're interesting to other people as well. So how do we also, to answer your question, Cecily, how do we fill the silences in these archives? Because like you said, Dr. Squires, doesn't mean that because these stories aren't widely shared, that these archives aren't there. It's who's looking for them. So I think also opening up, you know, inviting other Black scholars and anyone else who wants to write about or research or do, you know, like Dr. Gardner's doing, you know, things related to the earth and that kind of research, just opening it up to kind of what we don't traditionally think as people who write and talk about these things too in our state as well.
And I loved, Dr. Squires, did you want to say something?
No, I was just gonna, you go ahead. I'll chag in probably.
Well, I was just going to say, I love the distinction that you're drawing between record keeping and the living circulation of cherished objects and heirlooms. And, you know, I wonder if you could each talk a little bit about sort of what brought you to community-based collections, the work that you've done in community-based collections that exist outside of traditional archival institutions, and perhaps that had to exist outside of archival institutions, and how that work, you know, changes or affects how you think about what an archive is, what knowledge is, and what history is. And then as an aside, and I'm sort of reticent to ask this because, you know, I don't want to put, you know, the three Black scholars who we've invited to speak to us tonight to tell us what to do as archival professionals, but yet there's also a question of how archival institutions like the University of Minnesota Libraries, like the Historical Society, can raise up community collections, how we can share resources or extend whatever we can that would help those institutions, those organizations survive the long years, so that that trust that has been so well put can be maintained.
Well, I'll answer your second question first. I think, you know, resource sharing is an interesting concept. And I think it's an interesting concept because on the face, it sounds like it's an equal playing field, but it actually isn't. There's asymmetrical relationships with well-established, well-resourced institutions and community-based institutions in terms of money, right? In terms of space. And so, and in terms of things like grants and fellowships, where there's this impulse to say, we want to diversify, we want to think about diversity, inclusion, equality, but then the gatekeeping doesn't change. And I'll give a specific example. Grant writing is a very specialized skill. And so even when institutions develop grants that are specifically targeted towards people who have been traditionally excluded, if they use the same logics and language and criteria and the same kind of review boards to evaluate this new group of people who they're trying to open their doors to and open the coffers to, then you get the same result, is that only people who think with those same logistical frameworks get included. And so, you know, I've been involved in, I'm not saying that I should have gotten specific grants, but it took a lot of tries for the Hallie Q. Brown Community Archive to get support for its work. And part of it was just finally finding insiders who would help. And that just doesn't feel good, right? That just doesn't feel good when you're invited to be on the panel, you're invited to be at the event, you're invited to be a commenter, and like, oh, apply for this grant. And then you apply for the grant, it's like rejected. And so that dynamic, I think, has to shift, and really organizations, philanthropy, and arts boards and libraries really rethinking like all of the levels of gatekeeping that go on for exchange to happen on an equal playing field. Because I think for me personally, I am very privileged to be a professor. Now I'm an interim dean. And so that helps me open certain doors, and that's great. But it still only goes so far. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating, and people feel like they're having a bait and switch pulled on them, and that further erodes the trust that was barely there, if it was there at all. So I feel like there's a bunch of different levels of gatekeeping that really need to be mapped out and then kind of attacked one by one, so that folks can transform the processes, not just the intentions, because intentions only get you so far. And I think the people who have the connections to communities also don't want to be involved with potentially opening up those communities to exploitation. And so giving up the reins and giving up the decision-making power in these kinds of exchanges is going to be part of the process to build that trust, and also to really let people stretch and show what they can do.
Let's see. Okay, I think I can answer your first question first. Because I think, like Catherine, you nailed it. I think my first sort of curiosities about archives came from literature. Like I was reading Toni Morrison, and I realized after hearing her talk about her work that she was also a researcher. Because like I didn't know historians, you know, as such, like coming up. And then I realized, you know, at a certain point, that all of the kind of like art objects had massive amounts of like, if a thing had value attached to it, that somebody had like accessioned it into a collection, and therefore also it had like massive amounts of research and data attached to it. Like I started learning these things in pieces, and that those things started driving my own curiosity about where archives had come from. And like they are deeply problematic. Like archives come from, you know, colonization, like collecting exotic things, and then a single individual who used to be able to touch them, putting them into a museum, and now nobody can touch them. So like those kind of like odd things, like coming from, you know, like literature, where it's like, you know, Toni Morrison is like amassing like this, like looking at, you know, the Harlem Book of the Dead, like these are archives, or the Black Book, like she makes her own archive, like the Black Book. And then looking further back and sort of seeing, you know, like, well, these are sort of these are experimentations that Black folks have come up with, that are really distinct and different from like where that kind of phenomena began. Which does get back to like the point that Catherine is getting at, you know, like when you think about working with community, and also think about, you know, what archives can be or what they can do, there's a very fragile, it seems like, bridge to make. And, you know, are you acting as the bridge, or, you know, are you creating a bridge? You know, like those things are really fragile and delicate relationships. And I'd be also really curious to like hear you talk about that too, Jojo, because you're asking people for their trust, and for their stories, and those things take time, and, you know, relationship building takes time. So in the work that I've done, like that has always been a thing, and an ongoing conversation around, you know, like what you consent to and when you can withdraw your consent, and there's not a sort of finite point at which it's like it's done and complete. So yeah, those are my thoughts. And yeah, love to
Yeah,
hear
I can answer kind of in two parts too, because I want to circle back around to what you said. And I think this kind of relates to what Dr. Squires says too, but in terms of trust and, you know, archives, I think you have to think about who the archives belong to. And I'm forgetting the name of this really famous photo of a former enslaved person. And I can't remember, I think it's Harvard University, but don't quote me. But I think they were in some kind of legal dispute with the family, like who owns this photo, right? Like you know, this photographer took it and now you own it in your collections, but this is my family member. So I think, you know, so you should give it back. So I think that's one thing in terms of making it more accessible is, are there ways that institutions can give some of these archives back if they can find family members and then ask to borrow them or use them in exhibitions later. I don't know if that would take away some of the power structures you were talking about, Dr. Squire, but that's one thing that I was kind of came up with what you said, Dr. Gardner. And then in terms of AICM, you know, it's kind of weird because we're kind of walking that line too, right? Like these stories that everyone shared with us, as 21 narrators, they're not our stories, right? And they're not my stories. So I think I was lucky enough to get people who understood that, especially for Black Minnesota history, these stories aren't shared widely. So I think because our 21 narrators had a deep appreciation about that question of whose stories get told, that they were really open to us. And I think because we were a Black organization trying to do this, you know, they were open, and I'm really grateful for that. But it was also, I also felt kind of like, well, I have to be delicate because these aren't our stories, these aren't their stories. So, and Dr. Gardner, what you were saying, even with your family, like asking certain questions in a certain way, you know, so that you're not being, you know, so that you're not exploiting in the way that you almost might follow larger institutions that have been kind of doing this, because that's just kind of the model, right? That's what we have said, you know, how to properly catalog and do and take oral histories and all this kind of thing. So for us, it was kind of a, you know, fine line to walk. And I did this project with our board member, Jeremiah Ellis, as well. So, so it's something, you know, I think we were lucky to have 21 narrators who understood that it's important for future archives, right, to have these stories.
Before we move into questions from the audience, I would love it if each of you could reflect on your most cherished or happiest experience or encounter in an archive, however defined.
It's hard for me to remember mine, but so I'll share something that another artist found. The artist Mindy and Keith Obadike did a project in which they were researching in Monticello, and they found a bell that belonged to Sally Hemings. And so they made this like amazing sound piece from that bell. I mean, like, you know, the rarity of sort of getting to find that object, but then also asking like, well, can we ring the bell? And then being able to make a sort of sonic, you know, work from that. That's like, you know, allows other people into this thing that nobody knew that existed. And of course it's a servant's bell. Of course that's what it is. So it has all these other like meta narratives, but so I can't think of like my own, but like that's one that's like very present in my mind all the time.
I can just say things that I've been working on currently. It's funny because now, you know, there are a lot of digital archives. So a lot of these moments happen at home, but just hearing Black women, especially in their own voice, or even through the history of the Black press, through the Black press. So I'm currently writing an article about Ida Dorsey, who was a famous madam here around the turn of the century in Minneapolis and in St. Paul for a couple of years too. So just reading how the Black press responded to her, and that's kind of the thesis of the article I'm writing now, how her life was so complicated, because in our present, like 21st century minds, we're like, oh, here's this madam who's really successful. She was the most successful madam in Minneapolis, but she also had a whites only policy. So, you know, it's not someone you can really cheer for, you know, but then also reading about like one of her love affairs as well. So I had these moments where I was kind of laughing and just shocked and all these kind of things, but they happened at home. So in a digital archive. So that's just kind of what I'm working with presently.
I'll just go back to the story I started with today when I was working with my new research assistant, who's an architecture student, and he's been looking at Cap Wigington's drawings and just marveling at how much skill he had to have, you know, in 1920 to be drawing by hand, right? And just comparing his own experience learning AutoCAD and all these computer programs that can make something look like a hand drawing. And just him calculating in, as we're talking, how much time each of these drawings must have taken Cap Wigington and his assistant to do, and how much care and how detailed they are and how beautiful they are, and how he's just going through all these things. And again, at the same time, it's bittersweet, because at the same time, he's also saying to himself, I've been at this university for 3.5 years and I've never heard this man's name. You know, that to me is like the tension of the joy of the archives, right? As these new models of archiving are coming out, and new ways of thinking about how we bring people into history and make them feel more agentic in being storytellers, as well as having stories to share after decades and decades of being not seen as someone who's worthy of having their story preserved, right? And so that kind of excitement and being able to see yourself in the archive, even as you're understanding that the politics of the archive have made it hard for you to see yourself in history, right? That sort of tension. I just saw it unfold in real time in our meeting today. And you know, I continue to have those moments as I do my own work. But I hope that we can make some shifts in the way we teach and the way we organize exhibitions at the university and other places, so that we don't have so many generations of students saying, why didn't I know this until I'm almost done, right? What kinds of opportunities did they lose by not knowing those stories before the moment they kind of trip into an opportunity to know the story?
Well, I welcome each of you to pose your own questions to each other, as well as to our audience to pose questions through the Q&A. We have a couple already. So I'll start with a question that says, the jars of earth collected in Alabama punched me with its historic meaning, and even more with its emotional intensity. And I was reminded of the art painted on the plywood that covered storefronts along Lake Street, and how they were collected and preserved once the rebuilding started. Is there a growing trend, or even the need, for unconventional archives that expand the historic record beyond books and paper?
Well, I mean, I think that there has, you know, a lot of the things that that, and maybe I should let you two answer this, but I feel like a lot of the things that both Catherine and Jojo were talking about, like, point to an established history of unconventional archives, you know, whether that's, you know, a family Bible, or, you know, your mind. And so, yeah, I don't want to oversimplify the question, but I do think, you know, that that is a long history when, you know, there's been, you know, reasons, a lot of reasons for not having sort of formal institutions to which you like give your stuff over to. So I don't know, but maybe I'll let y'all like answer that.
I mean, I guess for me, the question is, to what end? For what audience? You know, to what end? So I know there was, I mean, the example that you gave, the questioner gave about the murals on the plywood. You know, I remember being approached by a couple of people who were like, can you find any people of color who might help with this? And I just kind of felt a little bit taken aback by that question. And I understand where it was coming from. But then it made me have like 50 million other questions about what was the point of collecting and putting them into the storage. And then if they couldn't find any, BIPOC folks to work with them on it, then what would happen to all the things they were able to collect because they had the resources? And what kinds of questions would be guiding the way they were figuring out which ones to even collect? So it just kind of, at that moment of high tension, I just kind of shut down because it was just this weird confrontation again of this tension around like, well, what is the goal here? What's the goal? And that was something I couldn't really see other than we think this will be important someday, which just, I might agree on one level, but then on another level, I was like, but then the larger question is, why don't you know anybody to talk to yet? And that was really, this was a really rough moment. So those are, I mean, it goes back to those trust issues, and it goes back to the already existing unevenness of the relationships, that this, they couldn't even look around their own staff and find people who might have the wherewithal to make that network happen.
There's another question somewhat related. Have you seen predominantly white cultural institutions and archives, especially ones staffed primarily by white people, tell Black stories and or address silences well? Should I take that as a no?
Well, I don't necessarily know if it's a no. I'm thinking of collaborations that I've seen that have gone well, but it's been, Black curators or things that have been part of it. So I don't really know what they mean by white institutions. Do they mean like an all white staff was the one controlling everything, or, and also my own level of knowledge of any particular exhibit as someone who just attends it might not dive that deep. So it's just I don't know. Tia, you might have a better example from the art world.
No, I mean, I guess it's not a no. I guess what I was reading was Kayla Jackson's note in the chat about their experience as a Black archivist, which thank you, Kayla, for putting that in the chat, like, so we can also know that like there's another Black archivist. Maybe you should say where you are too, so we can like support you. But no, I was also thinking about like, there was so much in the past year about like, and I take very seriously not using decolonization as a metaphor, but like decolonizing museums, and like what the work was that museums really needed to do, so that there would be not just sort of surface level exhibitions, panels, galas, that there would actually be, from the like staffing on up, actual concrete change. And some of it did look like demanding that hires be made, institutions be shuttered, and or people give their stuff back. And so I don't know, like it's hard to answer that question. And maybe it's that, like, to be honest, like it's not necessarily a question I'm interested in, because like there's just like a lot of work to do. Like there's just like a lot of work to be done. So I'm like, maybe it's just not quite a question oh, hey, Kayla, so glad to have you. Woohoo!
Yeah, Kayla just got hired at Hallie Q. Brown this summer.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I like was anticipating your coming, and I'm glad that you're here. Yay.
I think it's more the question, the qualifier of well. I mean, I think those institutions do them well because, again, all of the research and going over historical method, I'm just from my background, is, they are done well. But the other question is, are we telling kind of the same stories? I think that's kind of one aspect of it as well. It's like you can do something well, but are you telling like a fuller picture of things? Or are we just talking about the same group of people or the same event that happened in Black history or in American history? So I think the qualifier well might be tough for us to, maybe that's why it's tough to answer.
There's a question, how can students that go to the university directly help preserve the archives and bring awareness to the history of Black African Americans in Minnesota's history? Or students who don't go to the University of Minnesota?
Take classes in African American Studies in the Department of African American and African History. Yes, it is, it might seem mercenary, but it's true. Getting more students in classes sometimes helps draw resources. And that's where you can learn more about ongoing projects or things that people are doing from folks who have been holding it down for decades and who have deep connections to communities outside of the U. So I would say that's the first thing to do, is support the department that is part of the University of Minnesota's history and drag the university kicking and screaming to actually get it done, right? I think that's one really important thing to do, is to acknowledge the expertise and effort that already exists at the university. That would be my first thing for a University of Minnesota student, is to take classes over there.
Yeah, and I would say too, like, I think pushing, I think pushing enrollments up in FM is absolutely important. And I also think like that to find collaboration across, find collaboration in unexpected places, so like I see and thank you so much, like, for folks who have been, Mr. White and Cheryl for putting the links to Cap Whittington in the chat, because like there you have, an architect who is not being taught in architecture. And like that is, some like demand that something has been severed there, that now it becomes the problem of African American studies alone to teach this like history. And it is not like when you have someone who is working in their field, they should not be divorced from their field. Like I think that's not okay either. And so I think, like, where does, like Black folks like literally do everything, like there's Black scientists, there's Black architects, there's Black artists, like there's Black technologists, there's Black like Black folks do everything. And so like, I think finding ways to make connections between, a history that we know is deep and ongoing, that we sort of like think about like where, like this is a thing in art all the time, that you talk about the abstractionists, you know, as Black artists and never talk about them as abstractionists, right? Like, and I think like you have to do both. Like, I think you have to do both. Like, you know, if like there's ways that we should absolutely not divorce people from their interlocutors. And so I think, you know, to like, y'all, like students have to be good researchers too, and have to ask questions like, why aren't we learning about, you know, Black and Native folks in this class? Like, because surely there are
There's
some.
at least one.
There's at least one. There's at least one, and there's probably the 10.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting, Tia, I just want to jump in, is that we're making the next step in the Cap Wigington exhibit is to create actually an urban planning lesson plan for our master's students at the Humphrey School. Like, why don't you know about Cap Wigington and that he worked for Parks and Rec and helped plan parks and the pavilion on Harriet Island and all these sorts of things? Why don't you know that? This is part of understanding how cities get made and how streets get named and how plans get laid over neighborhoods that are considered not historically important, right? They're not zoned in those ways, right? So this is part of the larger project. Just wanted to put a plug in there that you'll be able to take a class in Humphrey someday. But I totally love that, Tia, just reminding people that, asking the question like, interesting that how there's just nobody or just one in any class you take.
Yeah, I think, yeah, Dr. Gardner, what you were saying about research, but also you can add to the historical record yourself. So if you're in these programs, graduate programs, make it your dissertation, you find these, you know, unsung heroes or just people who have stories that are really important to, you know, some kind of local and national theme, you know, you can add to those as well, and kind of bring them out of the archives too.
Do you have any advice that you would give to a Black recent MLAS graduate interested in becoming an archivist in a community archive?
I think my my thought is to like plug in. My thought is to just like plug in where you are, you know, like my experience of moving into a place that I, you know, like I did, like I'm not, this isn't where I'm from. And so like you have to find community, and like when you plug in to a place, you know, humbly so, because like you don't, you know, like you have to build trust with people. People will guide you where they need you and where you can be most useful to them. And so like I think, you know, show up to things, you know, like not with your own agenda, show up with just like trying to learn and start learning, like finding elders, like finding good elders is such a gift. It's like such a gift. Because they'll always tell you like when you're being too nosy and when you're moving too fast or when you're moving too slow also, because I've also had elders tell me that. And so like you know, but I think like that's been my personal like experience, is just plugging in through, whether that's through my experience has been through youth organizations, but that can look like a range of things. It like what I know is that like there's always like Black folks are infinitely creative and always doing stuff. And so like if you find one organization that might not need you, like they can probably direct you elsewhere. And you might just want to hang out with people for a little while until you find a groove. But yeah.
Well, for our last question, one of our audience members writes, "Thank you for your individually valuable insights. Where is the best way for us to follow your work and continue learning from you?"
Well, Kayla just outed herself in the chat as the new Hallie Q. Brown archive archivist. So you can find her at hallieqbrown.org. But for me, again, I am in a lot of places. You can always just reach out to me at the U, and I'm working with a group of folks right now in the Cap Wigington exhibit, Frank White, who has his website on Black baseball history and African Americans in sports from the Rondo neighborhood, which is just amazing. He's working on this second book. In terms of the work we're doing on Cap Wigington, we hope to be debuting a story map and then start to work on the curriculum in the spring. And also hoping, and I saw Amelius White in the chat, that we'll finally be able to debut the curriculum, which is going to be for K through 3. We work with 2 amazing teachers from Minneapolis who created their own web framework for teaching Black history, and they're helping us teach the story of Toni Stone, African-American woman who played in the Negro Leagues in the men's teams, and Debbie Montgomery, local legend, who was also an amazing sportswoman, and making sure that students understand why there's a ball field named for one and a street named for the other when they take their bus to school. So that hopefully we'll be able to put out in new humanities engagement space at Pillsbury Hall sometime in the coming year once we get it all together.
We're in a few places. Right now, I think we're having technical difficulties with our website. So I think the best place would be on Facebook. So the African American Interpretive Center of Minnesota, AAICM, and also Instagram as well as AAICM. Let's make sure that's the right one. Sometimes we have to add an N, but try AAICM or AAICMN.
I am working on stuff a lot, like it feels like a lot of stuff. You can find me on my personal website, which I'm, constantly rebuilding, but it's Tia-SimoneGardner.info. You can also find me on Instagram at Indigeo Negro, NDGEO NEGRO. And I post semi-regularly there about things I'm doing.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you to our audience for your great questions. It's really been a pleasure and a privilege to be in conversation with you tonight.
I'd just like to echo my thanks as well. I think Dr. Gardner said it really well. We have a lot of work to do. I hope you can enjoy it, and I hope you can join us for the next 2 parts of the Friends Forum series on amplifying Black narratives. On October 28th, we'll host a virtual panel discussion about Black publishers and bookstores. And on November 18th, we will, fingers crossed, host an in-person event at the Capri Theater on the creation of Black narratives. This evening's program is sponsored by the Friends of the Libraries. And if you're already a friend, thank you so much. And I will say thank you to the friend chair, Amelius White, who has been just so instrumental in helping us this year. If you're not yet a friend, please consider being one. You can find a link to the friends on our library's news website, continuum.umn.edu. And thank you all for joining us this evening and for giving us lots to think about and lots to do. So thank you. And thank you very much, Cecily, for moderating today. Good night, everyone.